creator of Dry It, Can It. I'm not an expert, I'm a homemaker, but I like to share with you my tips, tricks, and recipes for dehydrated food, canned food, and freeze-dried food. Today, I want to talk about proper storage of your foods. Now, before I start, I want to tell you next week that I'm going to go into depth on storing long-term with freeze-dried foods because a lot of people have problems with food not being dry after a few months, and we're going to talk a lot about that next week. But for today, I want to share some tips and tricks that I use and some practices that I think that are important for you in terms of storing your food. You go through all the trouble to buy your food, oftentimes prep the food or cook the food, you can it, you freeze dry it, you dehydrate it, and you're wanting to store it for yourself or your family down the road. It's important that you have proper storage if you want to maintain that food and if you want to keep it from going bad. So I want to go through a couple of things here real quickly today. I want to start with vacuum sealed bags. So these are vacuum sealed bags that you can use in a vacuum sealer. You're going to seal them, and I think they're fine for short-term storage. By short-term storage, it's going to depend a little bit on your conditions. If you live in a really humid environment, probably only a couple of months. If your environment is drier, you might be able to get by with this for as long as 6 months. But here I have, for example, some oatmeal with some powdered milk and some cinnamon in it. When this is properly sealed and it's tight, I can't bend this bag at all. Well, guess what? I can bend this now. Not a problem. And this was stored in 2023, about 18 months ago. The problem with plastic bags are that they're not really impervious to air or to moisture. Think about when you have meat from the grocery store or you're thawing something and you get those juices that leak out. Obviously, plastic bags are a different quality, but they're not impervious long term. Here's the same thing. I have some apple slices that sometimes I'll store these and I'll take them with me for snacking or for, maybe a weekend trip or something. And again, look at these. These are completely soft because I stored them incorrectly. Now, I found these were stored incorrectly, about 4 or 5 months ago, and I thought I'm going to save them until I get around to doing a video, and that's what I'm doing on them, doing with it right now. But this is not long-term storage. These apples were crispy when I started. So vacuum sealed bags, short-term for the weekend, maybe even a couple of months in a dry environment are fine, but this is not long-term storage, okay? So that's the first thing. Secondly, let's talk about canned foods. Now, I'll see a lot of people do a couple of things. A lot of people will store them with the rings on, and a lot of people will stack them. And again, my kitchen, my rules, your kitchen, your rules. But a couple of things to think about. So here I have some apple pie filling, and I have some tomato sauce. Both of these actually are from 2023, and they both look good. Now, for starters, these were both properly canned. High acid foods such as tomatoes can be, what do you want to call that? Boiled. I can't think of the term that I want to use right now. They don't have to be pressure canned, but they do need to be hot water bath in them in order, because the high acid will destroy any of the microorganisms. With the apple pie filling, since I also have a Rebel recipe here and put some other things in there, I actually pressure canned this. But pressure canning foods or using the water bath method really depends on the kind of food. High acid foods you can water bath. Things like low acid foods like meats and corn and beans, those really should be pressure canned to be perfectly safe. Why? Well, the reason is because botulism, which is rare, but it's out there, botulism toxins can't live in a high acid environment, and they really can't even live in a high sugar environment. But botulism will grow when you have moist environments, which I have here, in low oxygen, which I also have because by the process of doing your water bath or your canning, that oxygen is expelled. Obviously, light will destroy your food long term too. But canning, if you keep your cans in a reasonably environment like your home, where you're not going to fluctuate to extreme temperatures, you're fine. Some people will put the rings on them. I don't put the rings on them, and here's why. With canned foods, if you have the ring on them and for some reason your lid pops open, you get what's called a false seal. In other words, oxygen is getting in there and your food can grow bacteria that you might not even see. If you have no rings on here, you're going to know that this lid is still good. Once a month, you really should go down or into your pantry and you should just push down on the lids and make sure that there's no give. Then you know that your lids are still sealed. But I think canned food best practice is not to use the ring around it. Let's talk about dehydrated food or freeze-dried food. Here I do just the opposite. I do use a ring. Here I have some dehydrated apples and I have some dehydrated cooked black beans. Makes instant beans, it's great. You can tell these apples are still crisp. They're hard, you can hear them against the jar. When I vacuum seal my jars, and there's lots of different methods to do that, I happen to keep in my drawer just a handy unit that's real quick and easy. I always put the rings on these. Why do I put the rings on here? Because a vacuum sealed jar where you're using a food saver, for example, or one of these handheld units is never going to have a vacuum as strong as a pressure can jar. So you really want to make sure that this thing stays tight. You want to make sure that your lid doesn't have holes in it and doesn't have dings in it, because otherwise you're allowing oxygen to get in. And again, my lids are tight here. But by putting the screw band on here and tightening that, you're making sure these lids stay tight. Now, there's some discussion about, should you put a desiccant in here? Should you put an oxygen absorber in here? For short-term storage or food that I'm going to use in the next year, year and a half, I generally will just use a vacuum sealer of some sort, and I won't spend the money on an oxygen absorber because in essence they do the same thing. But oxygen on your dehydrated food, oxygen and moisture will destroy your food. It will soften it. So you want to eliminate both of those things. And I think that in some cases, if I was doing candy, for example, in my freeze dryer, or if I had something that was really sticky, sometimes I'll put a desiccant in there for a few days just to kind of make sure all the extra moisture is out. When you're dehydrating food, you're generally removing somewhere between 70 and 85% of the moisture. Probably 80 to 85% is more common, maybe as much as 90%. Really depends on your food. But you still have a good amount of moisture in your food. That's okay. Dehydrated food is still going to store fine, easily for a couple of years, oftentimes more if it's properly sealed. The downside, of course, to dehydrated food is that you're using heat and you're using air to dehydrate it, and that heat will destroy some of your nutrients. So you probably are only going to have maybe 60 to 70% of your nutrients in the food, but that's still an important element to have in your pantry. So dehydrated foods, I recommend you use the screw band with them. I recommend that if you're going to have them stored for 6 months or more, you probably definitely want to use a vacuum sealer. If you're going to use this in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, or using it for snacking, I wouldn't worry about it so much. But do seal your food right away. If you take something out and eat a couple of apple rings, for example, put your lid back on, screw it back in, because your apples will very quickly, or your dehydrated food will very quickly absorb moisture from your air. You want to keep it dry. That's what's really important. All right, let's talk about freeze-dried food now. A lot of similarities to the dehydrated food. And with all of your foods, it's really important that you mark your food with what it is. These two foods, what are they? They look really similar. And if I'd have ground this down to look like this, I don't know that I would know what's what. Well, this is raw eggs and this is squash. Both of these are freeze-dried. I have dehydrated raw eggs too. So with freeze-dried food, you've removed generally somewhere between 97 and 99% of your moisture. So moisture is pretty much gone with this. So you really don't have to worry about botulism because you're not going to have a high enough moisture environment. But with dehydrated food, with freeze-dried food, the process of freeze-drying still isn't going to remove bacteria. So if for some reason you had bacteria or bad fruit with maybe mold on it, and you freeze-dry it and you put it in here, you're still introducing that bacteria. The process of freeze-drying does not eliminate that bacteria. So when you're preparing your freeze-dried food, you still want to make sure it's properly washed. If there's bad spots, you want to make sure that you remove those. But freeze-drying, because it does remove, 97 to 99% of your moisture, properly stored, instead of being good for maybe 2 to 5 years, it's good for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, depending upon the food. Now, is this properly stored for long term? No, because there's light on this, and light will, over time, not destroy your food, but it will degrade your food and get rid of some of the nutrients and the quality of the food. This is a great way, though, for a couple of years, no problem. Again, with the freeze-dried food, I do vacuum seal it. I'm removing that oxygen, and I want to keep it as fresh as I can. And I have it on shelves in the basement, which is generally dark. Sometimes it's exposed to light, but generally you want to have at least household temperatures, stable temperatures. You don't want to have moisture in there. If you're gonna, and again, like the dehydrated food, I keep the rings on my food because it makes sure that the lids are solid. And it makes sense to go through and check these periodically to make sure they're good. Now this one I pushed on and it just popped, but I actually had used these earlier today and haven't sealed that back up yet. Now, if you want to store freeze-dried food long-term, by long-term I mean for years, you really want to use a Mylar bag, and you want to make sure your Mylar bag is properly sealed. There's a lot more to that because there's different qualities of Mylar. Mylar is not the silver stuff. Mylar is actually clear. The silver stuff, or the color, actually is preventing light. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail on the use of Mylar bags and properly sealing those next week. Some people will say that they're going to use an oxygen absorber with some of their food, and I think that's okay. I think that's a good alternative to vacuum sealing. If you wanted to, you could use an oxygen absorber with vacuum sealing, and that's okay too. I think they kind of do the same thing, that's duplicative. What you probably don't want to do, though, I see some people say, oh, I'll put in an oxygen absorber and I'll put in a desiccant. A desiccant is something that removes moisture. If you're putting a desiccant in a jar with an oxygen absorber, you're really negating what that oxygen absorber does. Because an oxygen absorber basically is made up of an iron compound inside of those little pads. And in order for it to absorb oxygen, it has to have moisture. Well, if you put a desiccant in there, you're removing all that moisture, so the oxygen absorber really isn't going to do anything. Can you put a desiccant in here and then use one of these? Yeah, same thing. You're removing the oxygen. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that the air, you're going to have a package like this and you're going to say, oh, but there's still air in there. I can feel it. Air is 21% approximately of oxygen. It's the oxygen that degrades your food over time. So even when you have a properly sealed bag or a jar, and you're going to say, oh, but there's still air in there. Yeah, there's air, but you're removing most of the oxygen. These aren't going to remove it 100%, but they're going to do it pretty well for storage, again, for a couple of years. Long-term storage, you need to take the extra step, which we'll talk about next week. So anyway, I hope that kind of helps clarify what you want to do. Check your food once a month. Go down and press your jars. I don't advise stacking your jars for the same reason I don't suggest putting a screw band on there, because I think you can get a false seal. If you have to stack your jars, best practice is to have a bunch of jars, put a piece of cardboard or a piece of wood and then stack your jars so that they're sort of opposite, not directly on, that more evenly distributes the weight. I think that's still a problem. It's still something that I personally choose not to do, but I think sometimes it's necessary. So I hope this gave you some insight as to what you want to do. Labeling, super important, because I guarantee you when you put things in bags or you have things in jars and you say, I'm going to remember what that is, you're not going to. So if you're interested in learning more next week, subscribe to the channel, thumbs up if you learned something here. Please feel free to ask me questions and I'll answer them the best I can. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Keep on preserving that food.